Professor White, welcome to Perth.
What I'm going to be saying is based on the last chapter of the book, which has the title of today's talk, From Pleasant Deficits to Unpleasant Sovereign Debt Crises. And each chapter of the book I try to begin with a little vignette or anecdote or story, and this chapter begins with George Tavlos, who's an economist at the Bank of Greece. And he appeared at a monetary conference in Washington, D.C. that I was participating in November of 2010. And he opened his remarks by saying, well, it's nice to be back in the United States, and, you know, more than ever, it reminds me of Greece. And, yes, the audience there laughed a little more nervously than... So there's a picture of the book again, and a list of the chapters, which I won't read to you, but we're talking about the last chapter. And so what I want to emphasize is that these sovereign debt crises have resulted from a buildup of debt over the years, which was encouraged by the view that budget deficits were entirely innocuous and even pleasant events. So I'll talk about how that view took hold and some of the challenges that have been raised against it, which I think are becoming increasingly compelling. Here's Greece, which in 2009 had its budget crisis. The crisis, the sort of punctuation of the crisis is the jump in interest rates that Greek bonds had to pay to find purchasers, rising bond yields. So in fiscal 2009, Greece had a deficit of more than 13% of GDP, and its debt had risen to 113% of GDP. And in April, they had the crisis where interest rates spiked up as bond purchasers finally realized that the odds of getting a full payback were vanishing. And Greece began paying more than 12% to float two-year bonds. And that's a problem, right? When your economy is growing at a normal rate, say 3% a year, having 12% interest rates on government debt means that just through the compounding of the debt as it rolls over, and Greece is rolling over about a third of its debt every year, you have to roll it over at the current interest rate. The debt begins to compound at 12% a year. If the economy is growing at 3% a year, it means the ratio of debt to GDP is growing at 9% a year. And carry that out, unless there's some credible program for reversing that, it's clear that the debt's never going to be repaid. It's just mathematically impossible. It's subject to what some economists we'll talk about in a minute refer to as unpleasant arithmetic. Ireland is a little different, but just a few months later, Ireland had its crisis. And what was unusual about Ireland is it wasn't a sort of chronic deficit that built so much as a fallout from the financial crisis was the failure of a couple of the largest banks in Ireland. And the Irish government decided that, although they were not legally obliged to do this, they were going to make good on all the debts of the banks. But the banks were so large relative to the economy that in 1 year they ran a budget deficit of 31%. And over a few years, the debt went from 25% to 97% of GDP. And lenders looked at that trajectory and said, well, the odds of your repaying it are approaching Greek levels. And so they began to pay 8%, not quite as bad as Greece, but still too high to pay in an economy that's not growing at 8%. But the U.S. is not exempt. By my calculation, the U.S. is about 5 years behind Greece in terms of when we will hit 113% of GDP if present trends continue. And present trends the last 3 years have been budget deficits of about 10% of GDP. And you could understand it during the recession, but it's continued with the recovery. The recovery has been weak, granted, but it should have, in a normal, these shaded bands are the recessions. And you see the previous recessions didn't have that big of an impact on the budget deficit, and it reversed quickly when the recession ended. And here the reversal has been very weak. Of course, the recovery has been very weak. But a lot of this deficit that the United States government is running is structural. It's not just cyclical. There's an underlying problem that's gotten bigger. So that even in good times, there's going to be a deficit. And so here's the U.S. gross federal debt as a percent of GDP. It was climbing. So here are the Clinton years where it actually shrank relative to GDP. Here are the Bush years where it grew at what now seems like a moderate rate. And here's the taking off like a rocket. Again, it starts, the new trajectory starts in the recession, right? Tax revenues shrink, automatic expenditures go up. But it's continued even as the recovery, weak recovery granted, but it's hardly slowed down as the recovery has gotten underway. And so any kind of new spending programs like, the Affordable Care Act, I keep forgetting the official name, everyone calls it Obamacare, has been quite controversial because, you know, it's pretty clear that money's going to have to be borrowed to pay for it. It's true that the official projection of the Congressional Budget Office is that the measure is revenue neutral. But if you believe that, I've got a bridge across the Swan River that I'd like to sell you. Here just a few notes about the situation. A deficit of 10% of GDP consumes about 60% of private savings. The U.S. savings rate is pretty low compared to other countries. So that's sucking up a big amount of funds. And of course, the rest of it's coming from overseas. And that's helped the U.S. avoid the situation so far of paying high interest rates on government debt. The U.S. is still paying very low interest rates on government debt. But market sentiment can change. Japan, for many years, despite having a very high ratio of debt to GDP, close to 200%, has paid very low interest rates. But they've begun to get nervous and talk about actually trying to close the budget deficit. In the U.S., there's not been enough serious talk about respecting the fact that there's a budget constraint. This idea that there is a budget constraint, that every dollar the government spends has to be financed, either by tax revenue or by borrowing or by printing money in the worst case. I'll talk about more, but it's gotten a new name in the press. It's called austerity. If you recognize that there's a constraint, you're apparently a believer in austerity. Now, the U.S. has passed what just recently has been identified as sort of a critical benchmark, and that's a 90% ratio of debt to GDP, studied by Reinhardt and Rogoff, who are authors of a book I recommend called This Time It's Different, A History of Financial Crises, how people delude themselves into thinking that the boom can last forever. Above 90%, they find a statistically significant drop in economic growth. Of course, it's hard to believe that it's discontinuous, but that's the point at which they can find a significant drop. So there's a danger that if the U.S. doesn't get its fiscal house in order, then we're in for a generation of sluggish growth. Because the normal growth rate is 3%, to cut it to 2%, that's a big drop. I mean, that really will change the standard of living of the next generation compared to what it could have been. Of course, the official on-budget debt is just the tip of the iceberg. There are all kinds of entitlement programs. There's state and local debt. The federal government is now holding in receivership the two mortgage giants that failed during the financial crisis, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. If you add their debt, you get something more than 140% of GDP. So it's hard to believe that international bond markets are only looking at the on-budget deficit. If all of these are liabilities that the U.S. government is pledged to repay, then that's what they need to be concerned about. Of course, if you add in entitlement programs, you get some ridiculous number like 800%. But that's all speculation. And those are not, of course, legal, full faith and credit obligations. So there's still some chance that they could be revised. But here's the budget constraint I've been talking about, the government budget identity, really. It's a matter of accounting. Every dollar spent, G, has to be financed either by ordinary tax revenue, that's T, or by issuing new debt, that's delta D, change in the stock of debt held by the public, or, and this is a possibility for a country that issues its own money, issuing new money to pay the government's bills, change in the money stock, where M is understood as the money directly issued by the government, so Federal Reserve notes and Federal Reserve liabilities held by the banking system, change in M. So we'll talk about the different ways of financing government spending and what the effects are and what the debate has been about that. But there's a sort of fundamental cleavage between those who have argued over the years that debt-financed government spending contributes to the economy's prosperity, and those who've been doubtful about that. You might call the doubters the fiscal orthodoxy, and they include Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and in more recent times, Milton Friedman, James Buchanan. I'll talk a little about Buchanan's arguments, and most recently Barrow and Sargent. But the contrary view that argued that budget deficits were a pleasant event, I call Fiscal Keynesians. I put Keynes' own name in parentheses because it's not really in the general theory, this notion that fiscal policy rules everything and budget deficits contribute to prosperity. It's really Keynes' followers, in particular Alvin Hansen and other Keynesian textbook writers who sort of interpreted Keynes and turned it into a more mechanical theory who stressed this point, Ava Lerner being another one. My own freshman economics instructor, Otto Eckstein, had a book called Public Finance, which was very much a Keynesian textbook that I had to read when I was a student. And in recent years, Paul Krugman and Joe Stiglitz have been pushing this line that to promote prosperity, especially in a recession or a deep recession or a depression, government needs to take up the slack by spending. So let me give you some select quotes from these figures so you get a flavor of their arguments. Adam Smith made this fairly well-known statement that we should think about the government budget the way we think about a family budget. What's prudence in the conduct of a family can't be folly in the conduct of a kingdom. So if you want your family to be better off, if you want your children to be better off than you are, then you don't leave them saddled with debt. If you want to grow, enlarge the family's wealth, then you need to save and invest. And you don't want to borrow in order to consume. You might borrow if you have a great investment opportunity, but you don't want to borrow to consume. That will leave your children poorer. You don't want to borrow except in extraordinary circumstances. And Ron wanted me to elaborate on this, what I said last night, which is Smith actually gave the advice that you shouldn't borrow to finance wars, because if you do that, it makes it easier to fight them. And Great Britain in his day was fighting what he thought were a lot of unjustified wars to extend the colonial empire. And he has a very cogent critique of how colonialism was actually costing the British taxpayer. It wasn't a benefit. It was a burden to have this far-flung navy and colonies. So if you present the tax bill for each war and pay it, as you go, no borrowing, just pay cash up front, the public would be a little more discriminating about which wars they thought were worth having. Right? So nobody would refuse to pay taxes to fight an invasion, but they might start to refuse to pay taxes to invade someone else. Here's Otto Eckstein, and I'm sorry I couldn't find a picture of Otto Eckstein online, which is remarkable to me, but he did contribute an op-ed piece to the Harvard Crimson, and this was the picture of him they ran on the Crimson webpage. So here's the standard view that, Keynesian view that budget deficits are pleasant. Most of the time, the economy is below its potential output. Right? So there's some Keynesians who are more even-handed than that and say half the time you should be running a surplus and half the time you should be running a deficit. But the half when you should be running a surplus seems in practice always to be some other time than now. Right? So typically the economy is below some frontier which is defined as full employment or potential output. And during those periods when there are idle resources, those resources are just wasting, unused, so any spending that takes them up is in a sense costless. So it's a free lunch for the government to make use of those resources, and it's even better than a free lunch because the income earned by the previously unemployed will be spread to the rest of the economy, and you get a multiplier of more than one. And you don't want to discourage economic activity by taxing at the same time that you're spending. So if you finance it with debt, it's even better. So there seems to be the view that if you tax it through current taxes, that'll withdraw money from the system, right? Taxes are a leakage from the circular flow. But future taxes, which is what debt represents, right? That's a matter of arithmetic. Those are sort of lost sight of, and they don't seem to affect anybody's behavior in this way of thinking. That's going to be one of the criticisms offered of the model. More recently, Paul Krugman, arguing that anything that raises economic activity, including fiscal stimulus, by which he means increased spending or reduced taxes, larger deficit. He said people used to worry that if the government is borrowing 60% of savings, that will make fewer funds available for private enterprise, for industry to invest. He says, no, forget all that. There's no scarcity here. The increased government spending will expand the economy by so much that there will actually be more that industry will be able and willing to invest. So it'll actually crowd in investment. So Krugman kind of reaches a rhetorical height where he says, it's irresponsible not to have bigger deficits because we'll be leaving our children poorer if we don't crowd in this additional investment. Right? And no concern about actually what the government spending is on, right? Whether it pays for itself, whether it passes any kind of cost-benefit test. Any government spending will do the job. Now, some of this kind of message left politicians with the impression that government spending financed by debt was, as I said, better than a free lunch. So why wouldn't you do it? Right? If you get the message that not doing it leaves the economy poorer, then why wouldn't you do it? It certainly makes you more popular to announce new spending projects. And if you're financing it with debt, then you don't have to announce new taxes at the same time. And you can sort of bury the fact that it implies higher future taxes to service the debt. One of the early critics were, para-critics were James Buchanan and Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner is now my colleague at George Mason, and James Buchanan is emeritus from our department. But they published this book in 1977 called Democracy in Deficit, where they said, we need to think about the political incentives that are set up by deficit financing. It makes spending look costless. Taxpayers will not object to it because the bill is being presented to somebody else. So armed with the Keynesian message, politicians can spend to their heart's content. So they're worried about that because they say, this spending really does have a cost. It uses up resources that could be used elsewhere. So if you could finance spending with debt, you lower the apparent cost to taxpayers of the government spending, of the resources being used for the purposes the government is choosing. And so the Keynesian message undermines the idea that you shouldn't leave a debt burden to future generations, and undermines the idea that there's no free lunch. So one way of putting this is, if the politicians want to finance it with debt because they think that'll make them more popular, there's a danger that you get more government spending than the representative taxpayer would actually want if they were confronted with the bill. Right? So it's not saying that there's no justifiable government expenditure, but it's saying there is a cost-benefit test that it ought to have to pass. And if you mask the costs, then you get too many projects looking like they're worth doing, when in fact they aren't, and certainly are not from the point of view of future taxpayers who are going to be footing the bill. Now, Some projects will even pass that test, right? If you are building infrastructure that future taxpayers will use, they would conceivably consent to that. But certainly present period consumption that doesn't leave them with productive resources is not something that future taxpayers are being benefited by on net. Now, Buchanan and Wagner contrast public and private debt, and I like to, how many of you are South Park fans? No? Okay, a few. So South Park is the most important political philosophy program on television in the United States. And this is Mr. Marsh. And Mr. Marsh went on a consumption binge. This was from the South Park episode that explained the global financial crisis. If you haven't seen it, there's a great scene in which the policymakers are trying to decide what policy to adopt. And the way they do that is they have a chicken in an arena, and they cut off its head, and it walks around randomly until it drops on a square, and they say, okay, that square says increase government spending. That's what we'll do. But Mr. Marsh goes on a consumption binge and buys this blender that costs $200, a Jimmy Buffett authorized Margaritaville blender. And these actually exist, and it's amazing that they haven't been sued by Margaritaville Incorporated. But okay, so there occasionally people take on too much private debt, but if people understand that they are themselves responsible for the debt they take on, then there's a limit. There is, at some point, and in fact in the episode, they decide they can't afford the blender and they try to return it to the store. But the store says, no, we can't take it back because we took the credit we issued to you and we sold it to somebody who collateralized it and securitized it, and we can't find it now. But on behalf of the Marsh household, the federal government has incurred lots of debt, currently about $15.8 trillion. If you divide it by citizen and then multiply by a family of 4, on behalf of the Marsh family, the federal government has purchased about 1,008 Margaritaville blenders. So there's less constraint, there's less prudence operating at that level because the people making the decisions to incur debt are not personally bearing the consequences of the debt. Somebody else is bearing it. So we need to get a little technical to kind of sort out these issues. But this is a university, right? So I'm allowed to be a little bit technical. Is it better to borrow than to tax in order to finance a given level of government expenditure? In a minute, we can talk about whether it's better to have a higher level of government expenditure. But for now, take that as given and just ask, is it any different to pay for it with current taxes than with future taxes? Right? Because if you pay for it with debt, then you're paying for it with the promise to impose future taxes. So does that raise the economy's output? So in terms of the budget constraint, if you're not increasing G, you're just switching between tax revenue and debt. Would it be better to replace current taxes with deficits? Would that stimulate the economy? And the Keynesian answer is yes, because as I said, taxes are a leakage from the circular flow of income, but debt sort of isn't in the picture. The tax cut and substitution for debt, the tax cut increases private expenditure. People have more disposable income. Government spending doesn't change due to borrowing, but the liability to pay the taxes in the future sort of doesn't show up. It's all, everything's in the present period. And this is actually true to the spirit of Keynes's general theory. He talks about output being determined not by how much you've invested in the past, not how much capacity you've got. That's not a binding constraint. It all depends on current period spending. But the fiscal orthodox answer was no. Right? It's a matter of budgetary arithmetic that you either pay with present taxes or you pay with future taxes. The future taxes, of course, are going to be higher because you've got to pay the compound interest on the debt. People may discount their future tax liabilities, but it's got to add up to the same number. The present value of the burden is what it is, whether you pay it now or in the future. So there's no reason to think that deferring the debt service provides people with reason to think that they are wealthier and can now engage in more consumption or investment. Now, some Keynesian economists, to give them credit, recognize this was kind of paradoxical to think that it was going to stimulate the economy. James Tobin, these are quotes, asked this question: how is it possible that society, merely by incurring a debt to itself, can deceive itself into believing that it's wealthier, right? If you say consumption's going to go up, then you're implicitly saying people think they can afford more consumption, which means they think they're wealthier. So Tobin accepted this idea that consumption depends ultimately on your wealth, not just on your current income. And Martin Bailey was even more explicit about it in a textbook. He said, look, if people foresee their future tax liabilities, then they're going to respond to them by trying to provide for those tax liabilities, which means they need to start saving today, stop consuming so much today in order to build up the wherewithal to pay the future taxes. And this idea became known as Ricardian equivalence. The famous article is Robert Barrow's article, Are Government Bonds Net Wealth? Right? And to someone who owns a government bond, it is an item of wealth. But then there are other people who are going to have to pay the interest and the principal back. To them, it's negative, and the whole thing is a wash because there's no productive asset that's backing the debt. It's just backed by the future ability to tax taxpayers. It's not backed by any stream of income being generated. And so Barrow basically took Bailey's intuition and provided a rigorous model in which it falls out as a sort of natural conclusion that if taxpayers are optimizing, they're basing their consumption expenditures on their lifetime wealth. When they're told, we're cutting your tax by $100 today and we're raising your tax next year by 100 plus the interest rate, they're not going to say, oh, I'm wealthier now. They're going to say, oh, well, I don't want to change my consumption, but I want to take the tax cut you just gave me and save it so that I can pay next year's tax. And so all the bonds the government issues will be purchased by taxpayers in order to provide for the retirement of the bond in the future. So there's no net impact on the economy. Now this is kind of a limiting case. It's based on some fairly stringent assumptions that this falls out as a zero impact result. But I think the intuition is pretty sound that you should be skeptical of the idea that by deferring taxes you make them no longer affect people's behavior. And I mean, it may actually discourage economic activity by deferring taxes, because when you have a tax today, at least you know where it is, you know what it's on, and you know how to reorganize your behavior to reduce your exposure to the tax. Whereas a future tax, who knows where it's going to fall, right? Typically, it isn't enacted at the time the spending is enacted where the future tax is going to be laid. So it creates more uncertainty in the economy about what's going to be taxed at what point, at what rate. And that would tend to discourage people from making fixed investments, reducing their flexibility for getting around the tax in the future. So Barrow starts from this accounting identity that the present value of the tax stream to finance the debt has to be equal to the value of what's spent. And people having optimized their consumption stream are not going to be fooled into consuming more. They're not going to be fooled into thinking they're wealthier. They're going to have to save to offset the future tax liabilities. So no first order impact on the economy. Now it's called Ricardian equivalence because Ricardo said something like it. Right? David Ricardo, British economist in the early 1800s. But Ricardo's argument is actually a little more subtle than that. Ricardo says, look, they have to be equivalent in present value. He says, but it's hard to convince taxpayers that that's true. Most people don't see it. Most people have this illusion that somebody else will pay the tax in the future. So this is the way he put the argument. It would be difficult to convince somebody that getting a tax bill today for £20,000 versus paying a perpetuity whose present value is £20,000 amounts to the same thing. He'll think that somebody else in the future will pay it. And if you say to him, well, if you're leaving a bequest to your heirs, you're leaving them a bequest that's burdened by this tax, and so you're not actually any better off by that. So, in fact, it's present value equivalent, but he says it's difficult to convince people of that. And that's why he, like Smith, wanted wars to be financed with present taxes, because otherwise you get taxpayers being too accepting of the spending, thinking somebody else is going to end up with the bill. So in a way, Ricardo didn't believe in Ricardian equivalence. He believed in the accounting equivalents, but not that they were behaviorally equivalent, because taxpayers would not react to the prospect of future taxes in exactly the same way. Now, Barrow's response was that, well, Ricardo made a mistake here. He assumed that people were less than hyper-rational, and that's clearly a mistake. But I think there's something to be said for Ricardo's argument, and especially when you observe politicians behaving as though we can spend more if we defer paying for it, right? And they get reelected. So what does that tell you? So Buchanan and Wagner pick up on this and say, no, look, you're going to get more spending if you can disguise the cost in this way, and you can disguise it in this way. People do not, in fact, hyper-rationally calculate what their future tax bills are and take account of it when they calculate their bequests, and so save more whenever the future taxes go up. Okay. All right, so second question, does more government spending promote prosperity? And these are separate questions, whether it matters how you finance it, and secondly, whether there's a positive multiplier from increased government spending. So call that case 2, where you finance it with current taxes, and case 3, where you finance it with debt and thereby future taxes. Does this increase the economy's real output? And the fiscal Keynesian answer is yes, unambiguously yes. And the reason is that some of the taxes come out of savings. Savings are a leakage, so they don't contribute anything in this very present-oriented way of looking at things. And so you get more total aggregate demand. Government spends every dollar that it spends. Taxpayers reduce their spending by less than $1 because some of the tax falls on consumption, but some of it falls on savings. This is what I was taught in college. There's a balanced budget multiplier. Even if you raise taxes dollar for dollar, it's not going to, there'll be an increase in total spending because some of the taxes will come out of what would have been leaking out of the economy anyway, savings. So implicitly, savings here is not going into the financial system and being recirculated as investment, right? There's no intermediation, apparently, in this model. Savings means the money goes into a mattress. That's a slight caricature, but I think that gets the flavor of it. But the orthodox view is no, it's not going to raise total income. It's not a free lunch. If the government spends on productive uses, then it could be a productive use of those resources, but we have to evaluate the spending projects to see whether they pass a cost-benefit test. We can't just assume that the cost is zero, so that it's all a free lunch. Right, so this is the battle which is now being fought once again. When the Obama administration was first entering office, they commissioned a couple of economists to come up with an estimate of, to justify their stimulus spending plan, or their recovery plan, they called it. And ignore the dots for a second. Christina Romer, who previously had been a very respectable economic historian, now she became a forecaster. They released this diagram. So if Congress doesn't pass the recovery plan, the unemployment rate rises to 9%, and only later comes down. But if you pass the recovery plan, unemployment peaks at 8% and starts dropping sooner. Well, Congress passed the recovery plan, and what happened? Unemployment was higher than 9%, which was what was supposed to happen if you didn't pass it. Right? So the dots represent what the actual unemployment rate was. It went to 10% in the U.S. And has started gradually dropping, and it's continuing to drop slowly, much more slowly than in an ordinary recovery. But judged by the forecast made based on the idea that there was a multiplier of more than 1, in fact 1.6 was their point estimate, it looks like the evidence is not favorable to that hypothesis. At least their forecast was not very good. So who was criticizing this forecast? Well, Thomas Sargent was one. He said, look, these are back-of-the-envelope guesses that ignore everything we've learned in the last 60 years, and by that he means Ricardian equivalence and taking seriously the fact that there's an intertemporal budget constraint. Barrow said something similar, but more directly, Barrow has tried to estimate the multiplier and found that, with some exceptions, a multiplier of 0 is the best estimate. And multiplier of 0 means that if government takes 1% of GDP, then the private sector shrinks by 1% of GDP. Right? So it's full cost. And he says to think that this all disappears when there is unemployment is to think that unemployed resources really aren't doing anything, aren't searching for better uses. They're just sitting there twiddling their thumbs until government comes along to employ them. Right? But if that's not true, if the owners of unemployed resources are looking for better uses, that's actually a productive activity. If workers are trying to reintegrate into the labor market, if owners of machines are trying to find profitable uses for those machines, then interrupting that process by bidding them away into some temporary make-work program is not cost-free. It's actually going to interrupt the process of recovery on a sound footing. So our default should be that the multiplier is 0. Well, I think I'm running out of time, so maybe I'll skip printing press finance, which has not been a real threat or not been a real practice in the current indebted situation. Fortunately, Greece does not have a printing press. But, I mean, the flip side of it, I don't know why I say fortunately, if they had a printing press, they could inflate away their debt. If they don't have a printing press, they default on their debt. In real terms, it amounts to the same thing. And so I'm quite puzzled, actually, by people who think that Greece could solve its problems if you just gave them back their printing press and they left the Eurozone and started issuing drachmas. I mean, that wouldn't change anything in real terms. It certainly wouldn't enable them to borrow to finance their debt. They would still have to default in real terms. All their debts are in euros, of course, so they can't repay them in drachmas. If they force the conversion of debts into drachmas, that's the same as defaulting. So let me skip through that and talk about the concept that Sargent introduced with some co-authors, which I think is very important, that there can be a limit to how much debt a government can take on. At some point, the market gets saturated with debt and says, you know, if you want to borrow more, we're going to have to charge more. You know, you're raising your probability of not being able to pay us back with each additional dollar of debt you take on. And a country can get to the point, it's kind of like the point where you reach the maximum revenue from a tax, which is popularly known as the peak of the Laffer curve. Arthur Laffer didn't invent this idea, but he did draw it on the back of a cocktail napkin. So it's associated with his name. But in kind of the same way, there can be a maximum amount of borrowing you can do before additional dollars of borrowing bring additional equal dollars of debt service, because the interest rate goes up on the entire debt due to the increased default risk. So if you reach that kind of debt saturation point, then if you continue to run deficits, the only option you have left is to print money, if you are a government that has this privilege of getting people to borrow in your own money. If you're Greece, the only option left is default. So that's what they worry about. That's the point of this unpleasant arithmetic argument, that if you reach the point where you can't effectively borrow anymore, you've maxed out your debt finance, the only thing left is inflationary finance, printing money. But of course, Greece does have a backstop in the form of the European Central Bank, which can be pressured to print money to try to ease Greece's problems. And they've resisted somewhat, but not completely. So their virtue, let's say, has been compromised. The European Central Bank has taken on a lot of dodgy sovereign debt that they weren't supposed to take on according to their own constitution. They violated their own lending rules. And at some point, inflation is going to start to rise in Europe, and we'll see what they do. Because they're going to have to choose between continuing to buy this debt and going back to what was supposed to be their one target, which was low inflation. So how do you avoid this fate of getting swept into the need to inflate to ease the debt burden? So here's Sargent talking about that. Eventually, you get a sovereign debt crisis if you don't constrain the deficits. Right? They build up to the point where the market doesn't want any more of your debt. And that's happening in Europe, right? So every time countries are rolling over their debt and it's growing, then they face higher borrowing costs, and that compounds the problem. So you can get sucked into a debt trap where each attempt to borrow actually makes it worse. And just as an aside, one of the things that really annoys me is when I read in the newspapers people talk about recapitalizing the Spanish banks by lending them money. Additional debt is not capital. Right? A bank that's insolvent remains insolvent no matter how much money you lend it. It's not a liquidity problem when the bank is insolvent. So how do you get fiscal discipline? So somebody before we started wanted me to say something controversial, so maybe this is it if I haven't already passed that threshold. There has to be some way of restraining the fiscal authorities from running endless deficits. And one thing that worked historically was the gold standard. If a government is borrowing money under a gold standard, it's obliging itself to repay gold. Right? The bonds are denominated in gold, not in something the government can print. So lenders are going to be skeptical. They're going to say, do you have a plan to actually come up with the revenue to service and retire the debt? If not, we're not going to lend to you, or we're going to demand some exorbitant interest rate. So that was a way of constraining budgets indirectly, right, by this sort of credibility test. Now, why didn't that work in the case of Greece? Because Greece, as I said, can't print its own money. So why didn't lenders say, wait, you're taking on more debt than you can repay? And I think it's because the European Central Bank is not the gold standard. The European Central Bank can be pressured to print more money and lend it to Greece at low interest rates so that they can roll over their debt. And they are being pressured to do so. And so I think there was a moral hazard problem that they failed to control. The European Central Bank failed to make a credible enough commitment not to bail out countries that had debt problems. And you've seen the reaction to the beginning of the Greek crisis, which was, well, here's the view I got on American public radio. If Greece defaults, then it has to leave the euro. First non sequitur. If Greece leaves the euro, then the Eurozone falls apart, second non sequitur. And if the Eurozone falls apart, World War III. So we have to do everything we can to stop Greece from defaulting. That was one week. The next week was 50% haircut for bondholders. We can live with that. So it's changed, but still, there was a battle as to whether the Greek bondholders were going to be bailed out by some combination of the European Central Bank, the European Union, and the IMF. And so there was some basis for their faith that somebody would pay them back. It turned out the burden was too high for them to actually be paid back in full. But I think that's why there was too much debt taken on, or lenders were too, ex post, lenders were too willing to lend to Greece at low interest rates because they thought they were backstopped by these authorities. So to control Greek levels of debt and deficits, there needs to be a credible commitment not to give them endless gifts. And that's the battle that's being played out in Europe now. How much will the German taxpayers stand for before they want Germany to leave the EU and the European Central Bank? So I think I'll stop there, and we can enjoy lunch, which is starting to arrive. And you can think of some questions in case I've said anything controversial.